seaweed extract. I'd like to get into that next. Now, this is a pretty common input. A lot of people use seaweed, but break it down for us. What is seaweed extract? What are the benefits? How is it sourced? So on and so forth.
Yeah, so seaweed grows all the way around the world, right? So the first thing you have to answer is what kind of seaweed do you play with, right? Because there are some species of seaweed that spend their entire life in water, right? Think of the kelp forest off California as an example, right? But what we're interested in is those intertidal zone species, right? And Ascophyllum nodosum is probably the most obvious example one, and that's the one that we use. And what happens is that those seaweeds, end up spending half their life outside of water as the water recedes. And when you do that, you create an incredibly stressful environment for the plant. And that's why the plant's producing all these secondary metabolites to survive in those conditions. And it's those secondary metabolites from seaweed that we really like. Now, you can take and harvest that seaweed, which is absolutely sustainable. The seaweed that we actually get is from the coast of Ireland, completely sustainably harvested. And you can take that seaweed and you can mill it, wet mill it into a seaweed dispersion, right? And you get all the cell walls and all the detritus and all the lignin and all the hemicellulose and everything that's insoluble in that product along with that. But what we've taken to do is we take that and we mill the seaweed and then we extract that with potassium hydroxide to create a soluble extraction of all those little goodies that we like. And that does two things. One, it cuts out all the lignin and the hemicellulose and all the cell wall stuff that you don't need and that's not soluble in water. And two, it increases your concentration of all those beautiful secondary metabolites, those plant defense mechanisms, compounds, and the rooting hormones and things along those lines that are in seaweeds that we like, and that's the route that we went. So, Ascophyllum harvested off Ireland, extract with potassium hydroxide, and that gives you the cleanest product with the highest concentration of all the goodies that we like in there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the potassium hydroxide next, because that is listed on the label, but I remember in a past conversation you mentioned it's not really in there anymore, but you have to put it on there from a regulatory standpoint. Fertilizer laws require you to put that on there.
Yes.
But you did, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that some potassium is available on there, right? Because there's a reaction that happened. Can you get into that?
Yeah, exactly. So potassium hydroxide is KOH, right? You've got your potassium ion, you have your hydroxide ion, and potassium is positive, your hydroxide is negative. And what happens is that when you react that with usually the lower pH secondary plant metabolites, the potassium remains and the hydroxide ions actually react with the hydrogen ions that come off the other compounds, creating water. So you end up with potassium salts of all the other goodies that you like in water as your reaction product. So there's no potassium hydroxide that actually remains as potassium hydroxide anymore. So you end up water and potassium and all your secondary metabolites. But the labeling laws under AFCO and state by state require that if you use a seaweed extracted product, you have to list the potassium hydroxide in there with it. It's just kind of goofy. And again, I think like that's probably another thing that you look at with the labeling laws. I think that they always come from like a point of good intentions, but I think sometimes they actually create a lot more confusion than they actually resolve. And but that's it's another podcast conversation, for another day.
This clip is brought to you by Stash Blend. Use coupon code THESTASH for a discount on your order.